Welcome everybody to the first video on the Games of Mars channel. I'm James O'Keefe and I'll be walking you through a recent game of Empire of the Sun which I played with Greig Goodfellow. Many thanks to Greig Goodfellow for being a stalwart and steadfast opponent throughout these few months as we've been playing faster at some times and damn near none at all at other times. Many thanks also to John Steidl, whose video series on Empire of the Sun largely inspired me to make this video series. Please follow the link to his channel if you're curious and seeing his take on Empire of the Sun, or looking at any of his tutorial videos he's made, which are very nice. I'm going to assume that all of you have some knowledge of Empire of the Sun mechanics and basic tactics. If you don't, again, please go to John Steidl's channel, who can give you the rundown on those. What we're going to be really doing here is looking at maybe not the best strategy, maybe not the best tactics, but the strategy and tactics that I was kind of thinking of when I went through my game with Greig. And I hope I can teach a couple of you one or two things. And I also hope that some people in the comments call me an idiot and tell me clearly where I messed up. So let's begin by looking at Japanese and Allied strategy. Now you can see this is the 1942 turn start. Operation Z and the Pearl Harbor attack are starting conditions in this scenario. And what this does is it dictates that the Japanese have a presence incomplete in the Philippines. They are well set up to march on Singapore and to march on Burma up here in the DEI. And they're also halfway into the Solomon Islands, the Australian mandates here, and they've already taken Guam. So the Japanese strategy in general, the one thing you can assume is that they're going to be going for the Dutch East Indies. Beyond that, I would expect a Japanese player to at least take Guadalcanal to prevent a shield, to start to put up a limited shield in the South Pacific right here. Maybe if the Japanese player makes it a point of emphasis, they'll go further and attempt to ahistorically go out to the New Hebrides. Perhaps I shouldn't say ahistorically, but more than the Japanese did historically. And a Japanese player could also attempt to make a move on Burma and India up here in this theater. Australia, I think that's really a target of opportunity for the Japanese. If other things go well, they can take Australia. And I would say similar things to Hawaii. If they get the Admiral Ugaki card, and if the Allied player leaves that open, then there's a chance for the Japanese to move in that direction. But principally, I think they're really looking at moving into the Dutch East Indies and then either moving towards India or moving to the south. I think that's the main decision which the Japanese player has to make. So as the Allied player, what I'm looking to do is generally slow them down. If I can delay the conquest of the Dutch East Indies as long as possible and make it cost as many resources as possible, you've done your job in 1942. January to April. There's really not enough Allied strength on the board to make a credible counterattack possible. So the first Allied consideration, and that would be their emergency naval movement. Before I go there, I want to look at the hand. I've reconstructed the cards I drew here that first turn. I almost always take the Arcadia conference card. I find the Abda HQ usually gets eliminated, but forces another battle on a non-resource and non-Dutch East Indies supply hex or national status hex, which makes it valuable. I drew the quadrant conference card, which is useful, and then it ends U.S. inter-service rivalry. With that in mind, I'm probably going to send it to my FO unless some opportunity presents itself. It's really useful to just hang on to until you need to get out of that inter-service rivalry. I've got the MacArthur moral obligation. Were it not for the quadrant conference, this would make a nice future offensives Q card. As it is, it's just going to be a good 3OC military event. Now I've got two other relatively high value military events. So not exactly the best hand you're looking at turn two. I mean, there's a lot of military stuff that I could move with my cards, a lot of good logistics, but once again, there's just not that much on the board to move, and some of what's on there isn't even in command. So with that in mind, I've got my emergency naval movements. Now you can see here I've already made some of them. I moved the U.S. Asian cruiser Biak When I play the Japanese, I generally grab Biak as a port to secure Fogelkop with. I can put Fogelkop under a air zone of influence and secure it further. I don't know if my opponent, in the end, I don't think he was thinking similarly, but that's where I chose to do it. The U.S. destroyer being a little bit more durable, I sent a Surabaya just to make sure he absolutely has to commit to a battle there and can't get it for free. The CAXer has gone to Dhaka just to stack it with the Far East Air Force and to make it in reaction range of anything going on in Singapore. And then finally, I took the cruiser Kent from Townsville and put it out in the Guadalcanal. And that's going to make sure, again, that the Japanese have to fight a battle in order to secure the rest of the mandates. The holes in this place, I feel, are really Batavia. Batavia is definitely a good port to take and then land units using strategic naval movement for a push on Chiatlap. Which the problem with Chiatlap, as opposed to all the other Dutch hexes, is there's actually a credible Dutch army contingent here. You can see that 612 unit, which means that you can't just roll in with one reduced Japanese army and a light carrier and hope to take this hex. It requires some preparation. So what I really go back and forth on is should the cruiser go to Batavia or the U.S. destroyer? I mean, really Batavia and Surabaya. I think that's also another very good option. But for this game, I was a little bit more focused on Biak. So my opponent for his first card, Greig, played Vice Admiral Kondo on the Southern HQ. So the Japanese activated these 8 units with the Vice Admiral Kondo card. One of the great advantages, right, is it's a military event, so you can declare more than one battle hex. That is a key limitation on non-military event cards for the Japanese in this first turn. It's a good Japanese hand when they've got at least a couple battle cards in there, because they're going to need a couple to wipe out and push around the many small and weak but widely spread out allied units here. And so the first thing is the 15th Army moving towards Rangoon, along with the 21st Air Flotilla flying into Hanoi to support them. Secondly, the 38th Army is going to come down into Kuantan, while the 22nd Air Flotilla flies into Kuala Lumpur to support them as well. And now the advantage of having both those air flotillas in on the combat is that, yes, they could possibly reduce these units before the combat begins, but the Japanese player will gain a +2 die roll modifier in any event by having air units in the battle. Next, we've got just the 5th Air Division fighting a pure air naval battle with the Far East Air Force over Manila. Finally, the last combat is the light carrier Ryuho going out to sea along with the 16th Army, and they're going to move down here to Surabaya. And then the last move, which the Japanese made, was to take the 35th Army and move it, you can see, around this one hex of unneutralized AZOI and land it just north of Tarakan. So I would read this move in a couple ways. First, going for a Surabaya is definitely a move to get moving on Java, right? I mean, if you can get a port, you can start filling in units without having to waste precious amphibious shipping points. This move by the 35th Army here is really economizing upon activations. If you're going to land amphibiously on Tarakan, you would want to have a Japanese carrier unit with you, like he's done here at Surabaya. What that does is with a naval unit there, and it may get you a +2 in the end, or if there's no allied naval units, if he eliminates the Japanese destroyer unit here. Or if we're looking at Tarakan, it would also guarantee you the naval one, but at the very least it also counts as an air unit. So then you can get your +4 in ground combat with just one naval unit. But if you're out of activations, you can just land the Japanese Army Division and move it into Tarakan later. So all these combats went rather well for the Japanese. Up here they just eliminated with no losses. Down here they also eliminated the 3rd Indian Corps with no losses. Down here, we probably did this wrong. I think we got the CBL Tsuiho and the Riho mixed up. The Japanese got a ×1 result, which should have resulted in the U.S. destroyer being reduced, but we eliminated it instead. No love lost, no great change. I think the outcome of the game was still relatively similar. And finally, the Far East Air Force was also eliminated, and no Japanese losses in any of these combats. So you can say it went rather well. The only post-battle movement which the Japanese made was to take here the 21st Air Flotilla and move into Bangkok, just to keep it a little bit closer to the front. Next, the Allies activated Operation Culverin. And so again, that's this 2OC military event here. And what I did with that is I used the Malaya HQ, and I activated first the Malaysian Air Unit, and then the 8th Australian Division. And I just took them out of Singapore. I sent the, first I'm going to do my naval movement, right? And you can see here there's an unneutralized Japanese AZOI, so I had to take the Australians the long circuitous route, and I put them over here in Kendari. And then I took the Malaysian Air and put it up here into Maiden. And so what this is doing is, I knew Singapore was going to fall, but this is creating more problems and more battle hexes for the Japanese. Later on, I'm going to put the Abda HQ here in Kendari. And then he knows he's going to have to fight for Kendari, which, as you can see, is neither a resource hex, nor is it a national status hex. So it's really a big distraction. And then Maiden, which is sometimes difficult to access by virtue of there being no ports in its vicinity. Having an air unit on top of it also makes it generally more problematic. Meanwhile, the HQ back in Singapore means that there will have to be a battle hex declared here at to take Malaya. So even though there's not going to be any resistance, it's still going to consume another type of Japanese resource in order to get this this invasion, this offensive going. So next card which the Japanese played was Rear Admiral Matami Ugaki, and they played that on the Combined Fleet Headquarters for 6 activations. And here are the 6 units which the Japanese activated. First, they took the 35th Army, and as previously noted, it moved down to Tarakan. Now, he also sent Cruiser Mogami in to support them, so they'll get a little naval support in that action of +2 modifier. The 25th Air Flotilla, using strategic movement, makes a number of hops down to Rabaul. The 27th Army here uses strategic movement to go to Eniwetok, which is really, you can't really read if that's a defensive or if it's an offensive movement. I mean, one, it's one of the national status hexes of the Marshall Islands here, but it also places a Japanese ground unit within striking distance of Honolulu with that earlier mentioned Admiral Ugaki card. Yeah, but with him having already used it here, the Ugaki card, to put them there, I think we can safely interpret that as just a reinforcement of the Marshall Islands, a reinforcement of that strategic barrier. Next, the 18th Army moves from Tokyo to Truk, again using strategic naval movement. And finally, the 17th Army here uses an amphibious shipping point to move to Banka. Now, key to note here is that this is a legal move. Yes, there is an air zone of influence over Banka, which would normally be exerted by this Dutch air unit. However, the Dutch unit being out of supply, keep in mind that the Abda HQ is not here yet, exerts no air zone of influence. It cannot be activated by the Malaysian HQ. So, although it's not at risk of being, well, first of all, the Malaysian HQ couldn't activate it even if it was of the same type due to this unneutralized 22nd Air Flotilla air zone of influence. But it's not going to provide the Dutch HQ with the supplies it needs to exert that. So this move doesn't have to be escorted. He can just go to Banka. Now, the results of this are fairly predictable. The Dutch battalion, the Dutch regiment there, rather, is eliminated. This is going to put the Japanese up to 5 resource X's. They're going to have then used 3 of their amphibious shipping points, accounting for earlier amendments. And for post-battle amendment, the Japanese simply take this Mogami cruiser and send it back to Miri. And so that's a good way that they can relocate the Mogami with one of those naval brigades. Cool thing about those naval brigades is that you can do an amphibious assault without using any amphibious shipping points, without having it just be a completely wasted activation, right? It also lent a +2 die roll modifier here in Terracan. So it was a pretty efficient move. On the Allied side, right, we've already used Operation Culverin. I thought it was time to put out the ABDA HQ. And so the restriction here is that it has to be put in an in-supply port. I think Chatlop would be nice, but it's unfortunately out of supply with this light carrier down here. So having already placed the 8th Australian Division in Kandari, I decide, you know what, that wouldn't be the worst place to put ABDA HQ. Ideally, I think you want to place it with a mixture of air and naval units to make it a more interesting problem for the Japanese. But if you just got to get it out there, Kandari will do. There we go, all the way at the bottom. Okay. And that was the Allied play. Moving on now, the Japanese activate the South HQ using Central Force for 6 activations. Okay, and here are the activations on that Central Force card. The Central Force card is really one of 3. There's also the Western and Eastern Force cards. And I think they're very nice for the Japanese in the beginning of the game. They do historically represent the very deliberate operations which the Japanese executed in Southwest Asia at the beginning of the war. And the one thing they're going to do here nice is that prior to movement, but after you've activated, right, you can play these paratroopers as a bonus. And what you do is you just remove a Dutch regiment, which is in range of extended range of one of your air units. And so if we're looking at Palembang, which is where the Japanese do here, the 22nd Air Flotilla can easily fulfill that requirement. We send them to the dead pool, and then the Japanese are going to get to just take control of it. And so it entirely eliminates the need to spend another of those precious battles on just a tiny resource X, or a resource X with a tiny Dutch unit on it. So they do that, and now the 17th Army heads into Teluk Batam, nice port and airfield there. The CVO Ryuho heads out to Kandari, along with the battleship Congo, and the 22nd Air Flotilla is going to move down here to Palembang. And so once again, that change of control happens before movement, so you can just move your air forces into airfields that you didn't previously own. Really nice aspect of that card. Gives them a lot of flexibility in their operations. And then the 21st Air Flotilla backfills into Kuala Lumpur. And so the way these battles all work out is a first battle is declared at Kandari. A second battle is right here. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the 38th Army moved down into Singapore. Once again, you know, it's going to be a certain win, but that is another battle that the Japanese, if they weren't playing these military events, would make it extremely precious. Battle C would then take place over here from Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, between the 21st Air Flotilla at Medan and the Malaysian Air Unit. And finally, the 22nd Air Flotilla It's going to be fighting this last battle. From Chiatlap to Palembang. Okay. Now, I did, as the allies, roll a successful intelligence intercept for this. I chose SEAC, and I activated the cruiser Exeter and sent it down into Maiden in order to potentially get a step loss, right? Because if you add it, we got 6 and 5, that's 11. If we get a ×1 result, we could potentially reduce that air flotilla. And in the end, I'll go through the battles here. Yeah, B works out automatically. Automatic win for the Japanese there. Over here at Maiden, I very fortunately reduce this Japanese air unit for no losses. And so that was rather unlikely. And it's unfortunate for the Japanese because if you notice this little yellow dot, you know that these air units they represent the elite air pilots, and it cannot be replaced. Now, even more unfortunately for my opponent is that the Dutch air unit here is going to be reduced. He got a 0.5 result. Unfortunately, not the 1x result that he would like. However, the Dutch air unit got a critical hit. And so a critical hit is going to allow you to eliminate one step of the weakest unit if you can't eliminate anything at all. Now, there's only one unit in this battle, so it has to be the 22nd Air Flotilla. And that's a huge loss for the Japanese, right? Like, it's one you don't expect either, but it's distinctly possible. So there's this two sides of the beginning of the game for them where they definitely want to use these elite units to speed up their conquest as fast as possible, but sometimes you expose them to these sort of risks which can have consequences later. I mean, the 22nd Air Flotilla is a very nice unit, and unfortunately will now be 10 combat factors for the rest of the game. Over here at Kendari, the bombardment does not go well for the Japanese, and they fail to reduce any of the Allied ground units there. Really, there's only one unit they can reduce, the 8th Australian, and they don't roll the 12 necessary to do so. So, I mean, all put together, a pretty outstanding turn for the Allies. Now, the post-battle movement, the CA Exeter, returns to Dhaka. The Ryuho and the Congo are going to post-battle move to Tarakan. And other than that, the 22nd Air Flotilla is just going to move to Tuluk Batong, which is going to complete. It still keeps the Chiatlap under Japanese air zone of influence, but without the CBO Ryuho in there, it's not completely finished yet. The ABDA HQ here now does fortunately mean that that Dutch air unit can be supplied, and so now they are competing zones of influence here. So the picture down here is a little bit more complicated. Although the Japanese have landed on Java, and they can do that overland march to Chiatlap. Personally, this is why I prefer Batavia as a landing point. You can land there, stage another ground unit, and then attack Chiatlap with 2 Japanese armies, either reduced or maybe 1 reduced and 1 full strength. You can get a real nice, favorable outlook on that CRT, and then go to Chiatlap. Surabaya, it's nice, still on the land. You're still guaranteed to stage over here in this hex, but it's a little far. So, next as the Allies, I play Operation Flintlock. And what I'm going to do with Operation Flintlock is reorganize myself up here in the Burma theater. Okay, so up here in the Burma theater, I've activated 3 Commonwealth units and 2 Chinese units using the SEAC HQ and my Operation Flintlock card. So we'll discard that. Still got 2 cards in my hand and 2 passes. And now what I'm generally looking to do here is to make the Rangoon stronger. Right now it's very weak with only 1 division in there. And to also place some units across these really railroads. I forget what the game calls them, rail trans routes, I suppose, to prevent any speedy Japanese advance up through Burma and then into northern India. And so to that effect, I take the 66th Army here, I move it to Mandalay. And I also take the 6th Army here. I'm going to move it to Lashio. I take this Burma Indian Division, and I'm going to bring it back to Imphal while pushing the 1st Indian Corps up to Rangoon. And then finally, the 2nd Indian Corps is just going to move into Akyab, runs out of movement points there, but that is something that starts to get it more into the theater, and Akyab is an airfield in the event. Now, why wouldn't I just keep the Burmese Indian Division in Rangoon? Well, it really comes down to step losses. If the 15th Army here were to move into Rangoon, this Burmese Indian Division, with its only 5 health points and 2 steps, means that the Japanese could easily win combat. Remember that the winner or loser of combat is determined by how many step losses each side suffered. So this Burmese Indian Division really brings more risk to any combat than it does in terms of its 3 combat factors. And so now, I know the Japanese really haven't been staging for an attack up into Burma from Thailand and then on to northern India. But this certainly discourages them from heading that way. I mean, the defense here is at least minimally set to accomplish the task. Next, my opponent is going to play Imperial Intervention. And he's going to play that on Combined Fleet HQ. Okay, so using Imperial Intervention, these are the 5 units the Japanese activate. First, the 23rd Air Flotilla makes a hop through Clark Airfield to Davao. And then the CVO Ryuho, the battleship Congo, and this last unit right here, the 35th Army, come out to Minato as well, and that will be the only battle for this non-military event card. Finally, Greig also uses the 14th Army here. And I didn't catch him, and he didn't catch himself until it was far too late into the game. The 14th Army will make an amphibious movement from the Philippines to the Celebes. Now, what's illegal about this is that he's moving from a non-port to a non-port. So you've got one option when you're conducting an amphibious assault. You move from a port to another hex of some type. It could either be an enemy port or just an unoccupied hex of any other type. If you're starting at a hex which is not one of your ports, your only option is really to use strategic naval movement to move to one of your ports. So it's a 2-step move rather than a 1-step move. So, here the Japanese are going to go up to 6 ASPs. We didn't catch it, and the Japanese will be ahead in terms of 1 extra activation. Now, this battle here goes predictably. The 19th Long-Range 19th Bombardment Group is eliminated, along with the Dutch regiment underneath, and the Japanese take control of Minato. And the 14th Army is in position to attack Kandari over land at a later moment. And what I think is really telling about this is that Abda HQ is once again taking Japanese attention and taking Japanese resources away from national status hexes and resource hexes. So it's doing its job of slowing down the Japanese advance, even though it really doesn't get the opportunity to put together a nice operation throughout the game. Now, the only post-battle movement from this Japanese offensive will be the Ryuho and Congo returning to Tarakan. At this point, I look at my hand and I say, well, I'm looking at saving this. I don't have to put it into my FO at this moment, and there's certainly not a good place to use this right now. I just use the first of my 2 passes. So going back over to the Japanese, they then play War in Europe as a 3 OC card on the southern HQ. Using that, they activate the Mogami and the 2nd Naval Brigade, the 28th Army, and the 16th Army. And the 16th Army begins its march over towards Chiatlap. The 28th Army comes over here and lands at Clark Field. And the Mogami, again, I'm sorry, that last from Bangkok to Clark Field is going to consume the last of the Japanese amphibious shipping points. But again, like we spoke of earlier, this naval brigade can be moved by the Mogami without any amphibious shipping points used. So that's a nice economic use there. And that's going to get the Japanese up one more resource X. Now, I really haven't been counting these, so we'll see where they're at. They're at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Maybe 10. Now you count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, yes, they are in fact at 10 resource hexes here. I'll put them down there. So the only resource hexes they're really missing are 1 still at Balikpapan, 1 at Manila and Corregidor, 1 at Rangoon, and 1 at Medan. So if they just, now the Rangoon one is one that could feasibly never fall into their hands if a staunch defense of the Dutch East Indies is put up. However, if they complete the conquest of the Dutch East Indies here and neutralize the Philippines as an allied base and just capture Manila, they'll be at 13. That'll round up. They'll be drawing their 7 cards that they would like to have during turn 5 and on, 1943 and on. So this is a slick little move here by the Japanese. Now the cruiser returns to Miri after this move. And I think that the situation really hasn't changed, so I take my second pass. At this point, the Japanese play Colonel Tsuji, which is an interesting card. It's a military card. It only allows them to activate ground units. And what they're going to do here is activate the 16th Army, the 28th Army, the 14th Army, and the 35th Army right here. And what they're going to do is they're going to do some ground assaults, because this card gives you a final die roll modifier of +4 in any ground battles, which is that take place in Malaya, jungle, or mixed terrain hexes. And so this is really nice for the Japanese, right? I mean, they can make attacks without any support, just using ground units, and have to hope them end up pretty good. And so you can see they make all the obvious attacks right there. And then finally, this unit right here uses that strategic movement we spoke about earlier to return to Saigon, to get back into a semi-relevant position. Now, I don't think some of these attacks were resourced very well, and it doesn't always go the way the Japanese would like. Down here in Chatlap, the Dutch division there gets a ×2 result, while the 16th Army gets a ×1 result. So that just eliminates the 16th Army. Not really what the Japanese would like. And over here as well, the Japanese also face a ×2 allied result versus a ×1 for them, which is not even enough to reduce that R Corps in Manila, so they're going to be sent there as well. Now, fortunately, in Kendari, the Japanese do get a ×2, and so they just eliminate Abda along with everything else that was there. So Kendari is the only place that goes well for them, but it's arguably the least important of these. I mean, Kendari is just a port in the Dutch East Indies that would revert to their control if it would revert to their control if there were no allied units there, and they took control of the Dutch East Indies. But in any event, they could get a vast number of other hexes by focusing on Chatlap and Surabaya. Manila is important in that it's a resource hex as well, right? So good card play, but not really properly resourced on the Japanese side. Next, running out of passes, take my quadrant card here, and I send it to the FO. So we'll just put it on the board there. Hide it from myself, and put it up in the corner here by Dutch Harbor. And having played that, it goes back to the Japanese now, who are going to play Tokyo Rose on the South Seas HQ for 3 activations, and this will be their last card for the turn. South Seas being right here, 3 activations. They just activate all 3 units here and Raval. The 25th Air Flotilla stays there while the cruiser Aoba, along with this Special Naval Brigade, head out to Guadalcanal, and they all get in one big battle. Now, I failed to make my intelligence die roll on this, and then what that leads to is the Japanese have 22 combat factors plus that die roll modifier +3 for the surprise attack, and they just eliminate the Kent outright. They just the Kent didn't put up very useful resistance in this scenario, but it did force the Japanese to at least resource this attack more than they would have with an empty Guadalcanal. But what this does mean is that now that they have both those hexes, they're going to take control of the rest of these airfields and ports during the political status phase. Finally, with my last card, I have the MacArthur Moral Obligation, which I just used to withdraw the Southwestern Pacific HQ from play. And so what that does is it puts it back as a reinforcement the next turn. And I can see that it's just isolated. I don't think it's going to be, I don't really have any plans to go to the Philippines, so there's no sense for me to keep an HQ there. I think the time is better spent just getting on the track and getting it down somewhere, in this instance, down in the South Pacific, where I can really start directing units with it. So that concludes all the card play for this turn. Then we move on to attrition. Now, there's only 2 Allied HQs left on the board. You can see that's the Central Pacific headquarters right there, and the SEAC HQ. So there's a rather large area, an even larger area once we account for some of these zones of control, where no supply can be given. So the attrition suffered on the Allied side is actually rather high. All the Australian units here suffer a step loss, which isn't uncommon in an Empire of the Sun game. What might be a little bit more uncommon right here is that by removing the Southwest Pacific HQ, I'm going to self-select the Dutch Air Division for elimination, along with a step loss on the Dutch Army Division. So they fought well there, but ultimately I kind of left them hanging and just let them take some step losses. But I figure there's still units in Chiatlap. They'll still have to put up a battle hex to get it next turn. These Australian units losing their steps is rather interesting in the game design. It almost always happens, and several people kind of furrow their eyebrows at this and ask, well, why is that? Australia's right here. How can they not supply their own troops, some of them on Australia? And Mark Herman's answer to that, I find it a good answer, is that it represents some of the battalions and units which were spread out along what I believe the Allies called a barrier of some sort. I forget the exact name, but they wanted to establish a barrier along New Guinea and through Java on Timor and Sumatra to stop Japanese expansion southward. And so you've got, for example, at Rabaul here, there was definitely an Australian battalion with some support units that was just annihilated in a brutal invasion by the Japanese. Not even represented in the game. So how do you model that attrition on the Australian side? Well, Mark says it's right here. The Australians are running out of supplies on these ports and in these locations. So moving on to the political phase, Malaya, with the Japanese in control of Singapore and Kuantan, then surrenders, and that's going to push me down 1 political will point to 7. And the mandates will go over to Japanese control. And so we can begin giving them control of these air bases, which makes it problematic to get, 1, back into the Solomons, and then 2, to fight them when they have so many options for positioning back in there. So taking Guadalcanal on turn 1 is definitely ideal if the Japanese got the resources to do it. There's a lot of advantages to that. Anyways, this concludes my run-through of the first turn with you. I certainly hope you learned at least 1 or 2 things, and if you have some tips for me, some errors that I didn't already mention in the video, please feel free to say so in the comments. That would be greatly appreciated. My idea with these videos is that we can all take a look at some other play styles and hopefully increase our skills when it comes to Empire of the Sun. Thank you for watching.